A little later on. Let's move along. You're watching Q&A. The next question comes from Kevin Brennan.
Mona,
where are you?
Can I ask you how a beautiful, gentle, civilized country like Egypt can sentence 529 men to death over the death of one person in a protest march? These people belong to a religious group, and it's a Muslim country. 80 to 90% are Muslims. Is this a fault of the legal system or the politics?
I love my beautiful and gentle country very much, but I do not like or love the military regime that has been running my beautiful, wonderful country for the past 60 years. This is the fault of many things. We're stuck inside this Bermuda Triangle in Egypt of three very evil powers. One is the military regime, two is the Interior Ministry, and three is the judiciary. And between those three things, we're truly, well and truly fucked. And this is why the revolution is stumbling. And what happened, this death sentence, I mean, I don't believe in a death sentence under any circumstance, but the death sentence does belong on the legal books in Egypt. But this judge sentenced to death 529 people after just 2 sessions in court, after just a few hours. We don't have a jury system in Egypt. So by no stretch of the imagination did they have a free and fair trial. I don't care what group they belong to. They can belong to Satan worshippers for all I care. Nobody deserves to have a trial like that. But as I said, those three things are just so powerful in Egypt, and they're our main fight. It's one of the reasons that I refused to vote on our constitutional referendum earlier this year, because those three powers were left untouched. Now, the one man that they supposedly killed, these 529 people sentenced to death, was a police officer. Obviously, I disagree with, I don't want anyone to be murdered, but no police officers have been held accountable for the hundreds of deaths of people since the revolution began. And we had 2 terrible massacres at the end of last summer, in August, when the military regime and its police force broke up protests by the Muslim Brotherhood in the Rابعة and the Nahda camp. I'm not a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. I actually detest what the Muslim Brotherhood represents, but I detest even more the human rights violations that our military regime continues. And the next president of Egypt, this wonderful, beautiful, sensitive country, is going to be Field Marshal Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who incidentally, when he was head of military intelligence, defended the sexual assaults of women revolutionaries under these so-called virginity tests, and was promoted to defense minister by Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president. So you can see why I say we're well and truly fucked. And we want you to condemn our military regime. We want a very, very clear denunciation of what happens in Egypt, because we're trying very hard to fight the military regime under incredible odds. There is no justice in Egypt. There is no fair trial in Egypt. And what you saw happen, unfortunately, is a result of that this one judge thought he could get away with that. Hopefully he won't, because the world, I hope, is paying attention.
Okay, Tim, let's bring you in here. So the system that Mona just described is the system under which Peter Grester, the Australian journalist, along with all these other hundreds and thousands of people, are detained without trial and with no prospect of a trial currently.
Yes, and what do you want me to say? I agree with Mona. I mean, it's disgraceful. It should be a reminder to all of us about what we take for granted every day, about the system of government we have, where we have proper separation of powers, an independent judiciary, a parliament elected by the people, a cultural understanding and sort of existence of human rights to every part of the nature of our culture and society, and how that then flows through. And we take that for granted so often. And when it doesn't exist, you get the sorts of examples that are just outlined. I mean, there's no ambiguity about my mind about that.
Ilwan.
I agree with Mona as well. And the situation that's happening in Egypt is very reminiscent to my context as well in Somalia, where there is no due process. Impunity is absolute, and cases like this, it should shed light on what's happening in Egypt, and hopefully also ensure a process to have such attention on the situations that are happening in Somalia and other places around the world too.
Ken, it's incredibly difficult to deal with this, and we know just how difficult it is to deal with someone who has relative power, a journalist who works for a big broadcaster like Al Jazeera, who's an Australian citizen, and we can't even dent the system.
Yeah. Well, the reason the Egyptian military is going after Al Jazeera in particular is, and it wasn't so much Al Jazeera English, which Peter Cresty works for, it's Al Jazeera Arabic that they hate, because that is the one independent TV station that's still beaming into Egypt that has not been completely shut down or censored by the government to give only its point of view, to insist that every Muslim Brotherhood member is a terrorist. And therefore, these kind of mock trials of 529 people where, in less than 2 hours, without any defense opportunity at all, basically 14 seconds per suspect, they get death sentences. That's only possible if they're all terrorists already. And Al Jazeera broke that monopoly perspective, and that's why they hate Al Jazeera. I think it stresses the importance of, first of all, the international community not just cozying up to General Sisi, as they did with Mubarak, as frankly they did with Morsi, because there's this tendency to simply say, well, we'll just work with whoever's there and we'll give them the aid and we'll gradually, through engagement, bring them along. This is beyond engagement. This needs serious pressure. And Egypt is vulnerable to pressure, because even though the Saudis and the Emiratis are these days bankrolling them with billions, they can't keep that up forever. The Egyptian economy is going to have to revive, and that's only going to happen if political normality sets in, which means an end to this massive suppression, not only of Muslim Brotherhood, but also of secular critics. And even though a number of those critics, I think short-sightedly, welcomed the coup, they're ruining the day. They're really having buyer's remorse, because predictably, the military is going after not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but anybody who criticizes.
We've actually got a question on that subject. It's from Hossam Meldon Ibrahim.
As a matter of fact, the situation in Egypt now is clear, and it's not pro or anti-Morsi, rather than it's pro and or anti the military coup that happened in July 2013. So my question to the panel, and in particular to our special guest, Mona, after the worst human rights violations that happened since July 2013, with 529 people being sentenced to death, more than 3,000 people dead, and thousands in jail with no reason. After all of these violations, can you now admit that you have made a huge mistake, that you were working against the first freely elected president that protected the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression during his 1 year in the presidency office?
Mona.
Thank you for your question. Mohamed Morsi was freely elected, but your job as a president doesn't stop after you're freely elected. Democracy isn't about a piece of paper in a box. Democracy needs institutions. Democracy needs to be encouraged. And you're also conveniently forgetting that in November of 2012, Mohamed Morsi effectively basically put into place his own coup, a constitutional coup, when he passed the constitutional declaration, giving himself tremendous amounts of powers, almost as much as Mubarak had, so that the Muslim Brotherhood could rush into effect a constitution that was incredibly flawed. Just as I said the military constitution a few months ago was flawed, the Morsi constitution, which incidentally left the military, which ended up overthrowing Morsi, untouched. So I think you're taking a very rosy view of
Mona,
Morsi.
I'm just to pick, I'm sure our questioner might want to get back in on this, but the question he asked really, because
Am I
it wasn't,
regretting?
Yes, exactly, because it wasn't only the military who staged the uprising against the Morsi government. It was the same people who staged the original uprising against Mubarak, went back out on the streets to get rid of an elected government, and now this is the consequence.
I'm getting to that. Mm-hmm. Hundreds of thousands of people in Egypt went out against Mohamed Morsi for a reason, and it wasn't because Sisi told them to go out. It was because they understood that Mohamed Morsi did not deliver. We wanted a president to help us through this transitional stage. Mohamed Morsi proved himself not to be that man. I personally would not have wanted Sisi to be involved in any way whatsoever. There are some Egyptians who would have told you we don't have anyone powerful enough to back the people up against Mohamed Morsi. Just as the military, when Mubarak asked him to go out on the street after the 18 days, at the time, Egypt also needed the military's protection, quote unquote. Even back then, it was a very, very double-edged sword, because they were torturing people, arresting people, and violating people's human rights. This is the situation in Egypt. So I think you need to take a much more honest view of Mohamed Morsi. I want military rule in Egypt to end. I want a president in Egypt that follows the people's demands for democracy and freedom of expression. But I don't want a president to be there to put the interests of the Muslim Brotherhood into office or the interests of the military regime. And unfortunately, that's what we're stuck with. But you hear, I hope, even though I am not a fan of the Muslim Brotherhood, that I absolutely denounced any violations against anyone in Egypt, because if our revolution is to stand a chance, I must defend everybody's rights. So you have to ask at the end of the day, who's speaking out? And as Ken mentioned, it's not just the Muslim Brotherhood that fills Sisi's jails. It's people of all political backgrounds. And in Egypt, we need we need to reach a stage where we defend everybody's rights, but understand that democracy is more than a piece of paper.
We've got a questioner down the front who put up his hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Hani Sorial. I'm an Australian Egyptian activist, and I wonder how in the world that a president will prove himself in 12 months while all the power is not in his hand, and they fighting him from the day that he swear that he will be a president. How you expect that this guy will prove something when we have a background of 30 years just Mubarak? I will not talk about 60 years, no, 30 years of Mubarak. He cannot do miracles, this guy. You're talking
about Morsi, right?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we should support him.
Okay.
We should stand with him.
Okay, we've got your point. And Mona, I'd like to hear briefly on you from this, and then I want to hear from the rest of the panel.
Sure. It was incredibly difficult, the job that Mohamed Morsi was given, but I have a question for you. Yes. Why didn't he side with us? Why did Mohamed Morsi side with the military? From the beginning of the revolution, the Muslim Brotherhood positioned itself to side with the military and not with the people. If Mohamed Morsi had, when he was elected, said, I'm going to side with the revolution and side with the people who are trying to truly free Egypt, he would have stood a much better chance. But what Mohamed Morsi did was he continued to enshrine and leave untouched military powers in his constitution. He took the wrong side. He should have sided with us.
Now, Mona, sorry to both of you. I actually want to hear from the rest of the panel. And I haven't heard from you for a while, Lucy.
No, you haven't, have you? I just wanted to make... Hope it's worth the wait. I just wanted to make one point, really, when it was... really something you said about pressure from the international community. And I find it utterly bizarre that the only real sort of international pressure or intervention came from the IMF, who wanted to impose an austerity program on Egypt, which just seems, in the midst of chaos, to come along with a sort of economic bureaucratic program of austerity reform just seems really, really inappropriate, but speaks volumes about the sort of pressure that we are happy to put on Egypt at the moment, and the sort that we're not.
Ken, just to bring you back to the question, was it a mistake for those democracy activists to go back out on the street against an elected government? Because the consequences of doing that, allowing the military to run the game, have been horrific.
Well, I would separate those two thoughts. The activists had every right to go out and demonstrate, by all means. There shouldn't have been a coup. Morsi was very problematic. I mean, I agree with Mona that, his constitution basically enshrined military impunity, military autonomy. They have their own finances, their own businesses. And he essentially tried to buy peace from the military at the expense of the long-term prospects for democracy in Egypt. He also, with 51% of the vote, ruled as if he had 100% of the vote by essentially ignoring women's rights, ignoring minorities, taking steps to undermine free speech. That said, the military has come in and, on the basis of 0% of the vote, because they never had a vote, acts as if they have 100% of the vote, and has been ruthless. I mean, they make Morsi look like, Thomas Jefferson compared to, the way they've been ruling. Morsi didn't gun down 1,000 people in the square. Morsi didn't imprison, 16,000 people right now and counting. Morsi hasn't overseen death sentences on the basis of, a 2-hour trial for 529. So, there were problems with Morsi. My inclination would have been to put pressure on him, work with him, but recognize he is the elected president and try to push him in a democratic direction, not to put my faith in a military coup, which has been an utter disaster for Egypt.